A toxic tour of Treasure Island's Navy warfare schools on Friday, November 15, 2024. Tour Carol Harvey. Video Skylar Sekoulis and Carol Harvey. Research James Pepper and Carol Harvey. The tour was sponsored by Bradley Angel, Executive Director of Greenaction for Health and Environmental Justice. He was accompanied by his team, Skylar Sekoulis, Camila Elam, Shirlitha Holmes Box, and Carol Harvey, investigative reporter and tour guide. What a beautiful group of people is in this car.
That's amazing.
We're driving to the top of Yerba Buena Island. Look at these views. This is what we're here for. I want to show you Treasure Island all spread out in front of you from up here. Here's Treasure Island from the top of Yerba Buena Island. Bradley asks the key question.
How did the radioactive contamination get here? Didn't they intentionally contaminate Treasure Island to train the sailors?
They did it because they weren't paying attention.
Okay.
But wait a minute. Bradley, in retrospect, you're right on target. The Navy did intentionally contaminate Treasure Island and expose sailors to radiation so they could operate the schools. The Navy also contaminated Treasure Island and poisoned the sailors by not paying attention to the proper operation of their schools. This becomes clear as we visit the footprints of 4 Navy radiation schools, all located along the shoreline, and consider the impact on the community. As you can see from this map, at number 1, we look down from Yerba Buena Island at Building 2, which contained the Naval Reserve School. Then we drove down to Treasure Island, to number 2 on the map at the shore, Building 233, where the worst radiation spill on the island happened in 1950. Then we drove from number 2 to number 3 on the map, the most toxic place on Treasure Island, the Radiac schools with the underground radium vault. We then drove west to number 4, Site 6, which is radioactive and contaminated with PFAS forever chemicals from the firefighting schools. Then we curve around the shore to number 5, where these radiation schools created a radioactive community. But first, some history. Treasure Island was built in 1936 for the Golden Gate International Exposition. In 1941, after the exposition was over, the Navy took the island for its administrative base and to conduct warfare schools for sailors. The one at the end, that's Building 3. The one ahead of it is Building 2. During the exposition, Building 2 was called the Hall of Transportation. Pan American had flying boats, and they were called clipper ships. Building 2, the Hall of Transportation, was the hangar for the China Clippers. They were supposed to connect San Francisco with China. Toxic site number 1. When the Navy took over the island, the Naval Reserves conducted courses for sailors in Building 2. This school in Building 2 was used to train sailors when the Navy had the island. In Building 2, the Naval Reserves held chemical weapons courses using deadly tear gas, mustard gas, and lewisite made of arsenic. For training in nuclear material, the Naval Reserves courses involved the use of radioactive sources like cesium-137, radium-226, strontium-90, and plutonium. The Navy's typically sloppy disposal of these dangerous materials polluted Building 2, the surrounding soil, and the waters of Clipper Cove. The sources are still there. They have half-lives of thousands of years. You can't get rid of the stuff. So it is now polluting Clipper Cove and the ground around it and the building. Toxic Site 2, the Radiac School in Building 233. In 1950, the worst radium spill in island history happened in Building 233 on the side of the island facing Oakland. We're parked at the Star. Building 233 was a Radiac instrument calibration school at Avenue M and 4th Street. This is Building 233 from the 4th Street side just before it was demolished in 2011. The footprint of Building 233 is behind this metal fence. In 1950, there was a lab there where they were teaching sailors how to handle radiation, and they had radiation salts in tubes. in this lab, and somebody broke a tube and it all went out on the floor. They tracked it over here under these trees, which was the parking place for cars. They walked it across the island, and they drove the radiation across the bridge to San Francisco. Toxic site number 3, the Radiac schools on Avenue M. Following the arrows to the right on this map, we drove from Building 2 to Building 233 to the Radiac schools at the top of the map. The Radiac schools consisted of 3 buildings. Building 342 on the left, a classroom. Building 344 in the middle, a radium vault. And Building 343 on the right, another classroom. This is the way they looked before they were demolished. You have to use your imagination to see them sitting on their concrete pads. Pull past those posts. Pull up there. Park right here. You see the concrete thing on the right here? The concrete pad under the classroom on the right. That had a building on it. It was a school for sailors where they taught them how to use something called check sources. Check sources are little pieces of equipment with radiation in them that you can use to measure the radioactive level in other equipment. Okay, they were teaching these sailors how to use them in the building on the right that isn't there anymore. Look toward the bar fence and you'll see another strip, another classroom. I walked into it. I've been inside it. I walked behind it. It was another classroom where they're doing the same thing. Right in the middle, they sunk what they called a radium vault 50 feet below the ground, concrete walls 1.5 feet thick. That was there in 2019. I videoed it. I nearly went into it, but I didn't want to go in there because they were holding cesium-137 sources, plutonium, and a lot of sources that they never told us about. In this vault, where they were protecting people from it, it was a concrete box, essentially, 50 feet below ground. There were steps going down to it with a padlock on the door. They dug that up, got rid of it. I came out here repeatedly and videoed it. There were homeless people living in the vault.
Yeah, I remember that.
It took them 2 years to beat in the top of that vault. This photo, shot in 2019, shows another failed attempt to beat in the top of the underground radium vault, Building 344 on Avenue M. Bradley visited in 2017. Building 344 was in the process of being demolished in 2019.
That building was here when I was here.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, it was.
You showed me, yeah.
You remember that?
Yeah.
That footprint is radioactive today. There's a skate park, tennis courts, and a little league field immediately to the west. From the Radiac schools, we drove west to number 4 on the map, the Navy's cleanup zone, Site 6. Site 6 was a Navy firefighting school and radiation storage yard. Where the PFAS is, the perfluoroalkyl substances, where the Navy doesn't know how to clean it up. On Site 6, the Navy had a firefighting school for 50 years from 1944 to 1992, where trainees learned to put out fires on ships. They lit fires and snuffed them out using aerosolized firefighting foam containing perfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. PFAS are a large group of bonded forever chemicals resistant to breakdown and cleanup by the Navy. PFAS attack the immune system and cause birth defects and cancer. In 2014, there were also boxcars in this field for storing radioactive material before moving it off the island. They were taking all the radioactive dirt and stuff and putting it in these cars and storing it in that field. So that field is radioactive. In the distance you can see Austin Hall, where the Navy held firefighting classes. This is Austin Hall on Site 6 in 2014. The Navy held firefighting classes here and stored radiation sources in this building. The building stands today in 2024. Finally, we drove southwest to toxic site number 5, the Treasure Island community, where people live with radiation under their residence residences and all around them.
Right in here is where I saw, because there were signs on the fences, like 10, 15 feet from the building, right? So from people's windows, back doors. And this was the radioactive cleanup area where I took the pictures.
In 2017, Bradley Angel, Greenaction director, took photographs to document the proximity of Treasure Island residents' homes and backyards to radioactive cleanup zones. These photos Bradley took show that people were living right next to cleanup zone fences with yellow radiation signs on them. They found radiation on that one right there. In 2014, the Navy evicted 24 families from this 1205 Bayside Drive townhouse after discovering it was radioactive. Then they erected a fence around it, which put it inside a radiation cleanup zone. Moving to the next townhouse down the street, in 2019, the Navy removed a basketball-sized clump of radioactive soil from under the front step of this address, 1203A Bayside Drive. Here, Navy workers are digging a basketball-sized clump of radioactive soil from under the front step of 1203A Bayside Drive. Moving to the first townhouse on the street, in 2014, radioactive soil was dug from under this sidewalk at 1201B Bayside Drive. And finally, in 2013, radiation was found behind this bench on Gateview Avenue directly across the street from 1201B Bayside Drive. These radioactive objects and soils were lined up under a series of addresses and a bench in a row along Bayside Drive. They all seem to have washed in a straight line down Bayside Drive from the shore, from the Bayside Solid Waste Disposal Area radioactive toxic dump. This means the whole street is radioactive. Recently, on Monday, November 11, 2024, at nearby Reeves Court, a block away from Bayside Drive, a resident used his cell phone to video two men waiting in the parking lot while a woman scanned with a Ludlam radiation measuring wand the footprint where the 1126 Reeves Court townhouse once stood. In 2024, they're still searching for radiation on Treasure Island. This raises two questions. How much radiation still pollutes Treasure Island soil? And does this recent scanning mean the Navy confesses they have failed to take it all out? Noting the multiple radiation exposures, Shirlitha asked,
"Well, how come they don't evacuate the whole area?"
Great question, Shirlitha. Shouldn't they evacuate all of Treasure Island?